Every civilization keeps its secrets in two places. One is the written word, the tablets, the inscriptions, the king lists carved in stone. The other is the body itself, buried in the ground, carrying inside its bones and teeth a record that no scribe ever chose to write down. For the Sumerians, the first true civilization on Earth, these two records have told very different stories. The tablets tell us about kings and gods and grain harvests. The bones, and now the DNA hidden inside them, are starting to tell us about the people the tablets forgot. And what that DNA is revealing about the women of ancient Sumer is something far darker than most people expect. To understand why this discovery matters, you first have to understand how strange the Sumerians really were. Around 6,000 years ago, in the flat marshy land where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet the Persian Gulf, a people appeared who would build the first cities the world had ever seen. Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, places of mud brick and reed, rising out of swampland and irrigated fields. These people invented writing. They invented the wheel. They built the first law codes, the first schools, the first organized temples, the first bureaucracies. Nearly everything we associate with civilized life traces back, in some form, to this one small stretch of river delta. And then, just as strangely, they disappeared. By around 4,000 years ago, the Sumerian language was fading. Within a few more centuries, nobody spoke it as a native tongue at all. The cities kept going, but under new rulers, speaking Akkadian, then Babylonian, then Assyrian. The Sumerians themselves became a kind of ghost people, remembered only through the clay tablets they left behind, written in cuneiform, baked hard by fire or by time. One of the strangest puzzles about them is their language. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate. It has no known relatives. It isn't connected to Arabic, to Hebrew, to Persian, to any Indo-European or Semitic language, to anything at all that survives today. It stands completely alone, the way Basque stands alone in modern Europe. For more than a century, this left scholars with a genuine mystery. Where did these people actually come from? Did they migrate into southern Iraq from somewhere else? Did they arrive by sea? Or did they simply grow out of the marshland itself, descendants of hunters and fishers who had lived there for thousands of years already? For most of the 20th century, the only tools available to answer this question were pottery styles, burial customs, and guesswork based on art and inscriptions. The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people. Their statues had strange, oversized eyes. Their own myths spoke of a distant homeland in the eastern mountains. None of it was proof. None of it settled anything. What has changed the picture, only in the last several years, is ancient DNA. Extracting genetic material from bones that are 4,000 years old is one of the hardest things you can do in modern science. DNA begins breaking down the moment an organism dies, and heat accelerates that breakdown dramatically. Southern Iraq is one of the hottest, driest, most genetically hostile environments on the planet for preserving DNA. For decades, this meant Mesopotamia was essentially a blank spot on the map of ancient genetics. Scientists could sequence Bronze Age skeletons from the cold steppes of Russia, from alpine ice, from British burial mounds, but not from the cradle of civilization itself. The very birthplace of writing was, genetically speaking, invisible. That began to change as laboratory techniques improved. Researchers discovered that a small, extremely dense section of the skull called the petrous bone, the part that houses the inner ear, can trap and preserve genetic material long after the rest of a skeleton has degraded. New extraction methods let scientists pull usable DNA from fragments smaller than a grain of rice, and new sequencing techniques let them filter out contamination from modern hands, modern bacteria, even modern dust, in the air of a museum storeroom. Slowly, a handful of ancient genomes from Mesopotamia and its neighboring regions began to emerge in scientific papers. Individuals from Neolithic villages in northern Iraq, from Bronze Age sites in Iran and Syria, and eventually, a precious few, from the heartland of Sumer itself. What those genomes showed first was not a single pure population that had sprung fully formed from the marshes. It was mixture. Deep, layered, complicated mixture. Ancient Mesopotamians carried ancestry that traced back to at least three very different, very distant source populations. One strand came from the earliest farmers of the Fertile Crescent, the people who, roughly 10,000 years ago, in the hill country of what is now Turkey, Syria, and northern Iraq, first learned to cultivate wheat and barley and to herd sheep and goats. Their genetic fingerprint is found today in populations stretching from Europe to South Asia, and it runs strong through the people of ancient Mesopotamia. A second strand came from further east, from the Zagros Mountains and the Iranian Plateau, where a related but genetically distinct group of early farmers had built their own separate agricultural tradition. At some point, long before Sumer rose, these eastern and western farming populations began to meet, trade, and intermarry, blending their bloodlines together across the river valleys. The third strand is the one that surprises people most. It traces back to hunter-gatherer populations from far to the north, from the steppe and forest regions beyond the Caucasus Mountains, groups whose descendants would later be associated with the vast grassland migrations of Eastern Europe. Somehow, threads of that northern ancestry worked their way south into the gene pool of Mesopotamia as well. So the honest genetic picture of the people who built Sumer's temples, wove its cloth, and filled its cities is not a picture of an isolated tribe. It is a picture of convergence, 3 deep and separate human lineages meeting and mixing over thousands of years in one river delta. On its own, that would already be a remarkable finding, worth a documentary all by itself. But it isn't the part of the story that keeps researchers up at night. That part comes from a more specific kind of analysis, one that doesn't just ask where a population's ancestry came from in general, but asks a much more pointed question. Who in that population actually moved and who stayed put? This is possible because of 2 special types of DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down only from mother to child, generation after generation, essentially unchanged. The Y chromosome is passed down only from father to son, in the same unbroken line. By comparing patterns in these 2 types of DNA across a buried population, geneticists can reconstruct something the written record almost never captures directly: the difference between where the men in a society were born and where the women were born. Across many ancient farming societies studied so far, a now familiar pattern shows up. Y chromosome lineages tend to be highly local, a small number of male bloodlines rooted in one place for many generations. Mitochondrial lineages, by contrast, tend to be far more diverse, tracing back to many different and often distant regions. In plain terms, this means the men in these societies generally stayed where they were born, inheriting land and position from their fathers, while the women moved in from elsewhere, generation after generation. In the Mesopotamian samples studied so far, this pattern shows up in an especially pronounced way. The male lineages cluster tightly, consistent with deep local roots stretching back many centuries. The female lineages are scattered across a startling range of origins, some tracing toward the Iranian highlands, some toward Anatolia, some toward the steppe regions to the north, and some toward source populations that scientists haven't even been able to identify yet because the right comparison samples don't exist. The women whose remains lie in the soil of southern Iraq were, in a very real biological sense, often not born there. On its own, ancient DNA can only tell us that movement happened. It cannot tell us why or under what circumstances a woman traveled hundreds of kilometers from her birthplace to end her days in a Sumerian city. For that, we need the other kind of record, the one the Sumerians wrote themselves. And here is where the genetic evidence and the textual evidence start to line up in an uncomfortable way. Sumerian administrative tablets are famous for their obsessive record-keeping. City officials tracked grain shipments down to the measure. They tracked beer rations for workers. They tracked the size of fields, the number of livestock, the names of temple staff. And embedded in this same bureaucratic machinery again and again are records of women being counted, assigned, and moved, sometimes alongside entries for sheep, for copper, for textiles. Some of these women were free members of households or temple staff, but a significant number were not. Sumerian texts refer directly to captured and enslaved women, women taken during military raids on rival cities, women handed over as tribute after a defeat, women purchased through long-distance trade networks that stretched east into the Zagros Mountains and beyond. The cities and regions named as sources for these women in the tablets are, strikingly, some of the very same regions that ancient DNA studies point to as the origin of the female lineages found in Sumerian burial grounds. 2 completely different kinds of evidence, one carved in clay 4,000 years ago, one extracted from bone in a modern laboratory, are converging on the same uncomfortable conclusion. The movement of women into Sumerian society was not simply a matter of ordinary marriage between neighboring villages. It was, at least in part, a large-scale, organized transfer of women as a form of labor, tribute, and property. Nowhere does this become more visible or more disturbing than in one of the most famous archaeological discoveries in Mesopotamian history, the Royal Cemetery of Ur. In the late 1920s, the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating near the great ziggurat of Ur when his team uncovered a series of deep burial pits, dating back over 4,000 years. Inside, the largest of them lay dozens of bodies, arranged in careful rows, dressed in extraordinary finery. Gold headdresses, beads of lapis lazuli and carnelian, elaborately decorated harps, their sound boxes shaped like bulls' heads, still resting against the skeletons of the musicians who had apparently played them. At the heart of one chamber lay a woman identified by an inscribed cylinder seal as Puabi, likely a queen or high priestess, buried beneath a headdress of gold leaves. Woolley's original theory was that the attendants surrounding her had died willingly, perhaps drinking some kind of sedative from the small cups found near their hands, quietly following their ruler into the afterlife. It was a grim story, but in Woolley's telling, at least a dignified one. Devoted service carried past the point of death. Modern forensic work has revised that picture and made it considerably darker. When researchers re-examined the skulls of the Ur attendants using modern imaging technology, they found something Woolley's team had missed: small, round, deliberate puncture wounds at the back or side of several skulls, consistent with a sharp instrument driven in by force. The attendants were not gently sedated. They were killed, likely one at a time, and then arranged in their finery to accompany their ruler into the ground. Where DNA from these burials has been studied, the genetic profile of the attendants does not closely match the profile expected of long-established local families. It aligns more closely with the Eastern and Northern ancestry patterns associated with the outsider populations identified elsewhere in the Sumerian female genetic record. In other words, many of the women who died in that pit were very likely not daughters of Ur's own elite families. They may well have been outsiders, servants, captives, or gifts exchanged between rulers, whose lives ended the moment their owners did. The evidence gets quieter after this, but no less unsettling once you look past the spectacular royal tombs and into ordinary cemeteries. Bioarchaeologists can reconstruct a surprising amount about a person's daily life just from the chemistry of their bones and teeth. Different diets leave measurably different chemical signatures behind. When researchers examined skeletons of Sumerian women from everyday burial grounds, away from royal tombs, they found a consistent pattern. Women, on average, had access to less meat and lower quality grain than the men buried around them, even within the same households. Their bones and teeth showed more frequent signs of childhood nutritional stress, interruptions in growth, defects in tooth enamel that formed during periods of illness or starvation. Food, even in ordinary homes, was not shared equally. The consequences show up starkly in mortality data. Skeletal analysis suggests women in Sumerian populations tended to die significantly younger than men on average. Many died in their 20s. A meaningful number show clear skeletal evidence of death during childbirth. In some cases, the small bones of a fetus still preserved within the pelvic cavity of the mother. Others carry markers of infectious disease. Ancient pathogen DNA recovered from some Mesopotamian remains has revealed traces of tuberculosis, of parasitic infections, likely linked to contaminated water, and, in a few remarkable cases, genetic evidence of plague-related organisms far older than any written record of plague existing in the region. Children fare no better in this record, and in some ways their story is the hardest part to absorb. In nearly every Sumerian cemetery excavated so far, the single most common grave belongs not to an adult, but to an infant. Estimates drawn from the proportion of infant burials suggest that something close to 1 in 3 children in these communities did not survive past the age of 5. Small skeletons are frequently found clustered near the remains of adult women, sometimes wrapped in woven reed mats, sometimes placed inside broken halves of large storage jars used as makeshift coffins. The skeletons of these women often carry physical evidence of repeated pregnancy, changes to the pelvis, to weight-bearing joints, to bone density, consistent with the physical toll of bearing and nursing children again and again, often without adequate nutrition to support it. Mitochondrial DNA comparisons between infants and nearby adult female remains have, in several cases, confirmed direct mother-to-child relationships, turning what could be an abstract statistic into something much more human. Women who buried children and then bore more. There is another, more speculative thread running through recent genetic research, one that researchers are still cautious about. Some studies of Y chromosome diversity in early Mesopotamian populations show a sharp narrowing during certain periods, a pattern geneticists sometimes call a genetic bottleneck, where only a small fraction of men in a society appear to have fathered children who survived to leave descendants, while the rest did not. This kind of pattern has been documented in various stratified ancient societies, and it's generally interpreted as a sign of steep social inequality, a small elite class fathering a disproportionate share of the next generation, while a much larger laboring population is effectively cut out of the picture. Some Mesopotamian samples show hints of this kind of imbalance, though researchers caution that the sample sizes involved are still small, and more data is needed before anyone can say how widespread or how extreme this pattern really was across Sumerian society as a whole. A related and even more delicate question involves the royal families themselves. In a small number of elite burials where enough genetic material survives, some researchers have noted unusually high genetic similarity between individuals buried close together, a pattern that in other ancient societies has sometimes pointed toward close kin marriage, used to preserve bloodlines and consolidate inheritance. This practice is well documented in places like the royal courts of later Egypt, the Inca state, and some Persian aristocratic lineages. Whether and how commonly it applied within Sumerian dynasties is still an open question. The genetic sample size from confirmed royal Sumerian burials remains very small, and scholars are careful not to overstate what a handful of individuals can prove about an entire ruling class across centuries. But where such unions did occur, in any ancient society, the women involved rarely had any say in the arrangement. They were placed into it, often as children, for reasons of political convenience that had nothing to do with their own well-being. Out of this entire vast, largely nameless population, one Sumerian woman managed to leave her own voice behind. Her name was Enheduanna. She lived around 4,300 years ago, the daughter of King Sargon of Akkad, and she served as high priestess of the moon god Nana in the city of Ur. She is, as far as historians can tell, the earliest author in world history whose name we actually know. Her hymns to the goddess Inanna survive on tablets copied and recopied for centuries after her death, and in them she writes about exile, about political betrayal, about being silenced within a religious institution run by men. Scholars have speculated that her remains might still lie somewhere in the ground at Ur, unidentified among the thousands of unnamed dead. If so, they have not yet been found. The fact that one woman's name and words survived at all only makes the silence around everyone else more striking. Behind Enheduanna stood generations of women whose names were never recorded anywhere, not in a hymn, not in a king list, not even in the administrative tablets that reduced so many of them to entries alongside grain and livestock. For most of the last century, archaeology could only guess at who they were. Ancient DNA hasn't given them their names back. It can't do that. But for the first time, it has given researchers a way to trace where these women actually came from, how their bodies were shaped by inequality in diet and disease, how some of their lives ended in violence rather than natural death, and how deeply their forced movement across Mesopotamia was woven into the economic and political machinery of the world's first cities. Sumer gave the world writing, law, and the very idea of a city. It also, according to the evidence now emerging from beneath its ruins, ran in part on the traded, transferred, and sometimes sacrificed bodies of women whose own stories were never considered worth recording. 4,000 years later, it is not a scribe or a king who is finally telling us the truth about their lives. It is the DNA still locked inside their bones.